Tonight, as the world grows quiet and your breath begins to slow, let your eyes rest gently, feel your body relax into comfort, and allow the day to slowly melt away like footprints in fresh falling snow. You're about to visit a place where time doesn't chase you. There, ticking isn't rushed. Clocks don't count the minutes, they hold space between them. And silence? Silence is trusted like an old friend who stays nearby even when no one speaks. Imagine a forest, deep, still, sacred, where even the wind pauses to listen, where roots hold age-old secrets, and trees remember lullabies, and buried gently beneath the branches of this timeless woodland is a small workshop, warm, crooked, tucked beneath the earth like a whisper of peace. Inside this little shop lives Elian. He's not the kind of man who fixes watches. He doesn't wind time to keep it moving. He helps it slow down so others can rest more fully. He's a clockmaker, but his clocks don't wake you up. They guide you back to sleep. In tonight's story, we'll follow Elian and a visitor to his workshop, a wanderer named Nell. She's been walking for a long time, not just on roads, but inside her own tired thoughts. And now the forest has found her, and it has a message. You don't have to earn your rest. You only have to slow down enough to receive it. So now, breathe in, long and soft, and as we begin, let each word bring you closer to stillness, to slowness, to a gentle kind of remembering. Welcome to the silent forest where time listens and you're finally allowed to simply be. Deep in the northern woods, past the fields nobody mows and the fences nobody fixes anymore, there lies a forest where even birds forget to sing, not because it is sad, but because the forest itself is so quiet, so still, so reassuringly slow, that sound feels no urgency there. It is called the Silent Forest, and no one knows exactly why. They say the snow falls in soft spirals even in summer, that the wind, once it enters the trees, simply settles down and naps among the moss, that footsteps make no mark unless the walker is truly listening. Somewhere beneath those trees, not high in the branches or deep underground, but just below the roots, where roots tangle like old knuckles, there is a shop, small, crooked, built of oaken slats, pine-peaked shingles, and sapphire glass that glows softly in moonlight. There is no sign, no candle in the window, but it ticks, not loudly, just consistently, a rhythm you don't hear right away, but once you notice it, you begin to breathe with it. Elian, the clockmaker, has lived in that shop longer than the map remembers. He is not old in the way of men. He is old in the way of weathered pages and rivers that have forgotten their source. His hands are not wrinkled but smooth from work. His beard is not white but the color of frost collecting on the bell of a bluebell flower. He speaks only when needed, which isn't often, not because he is unkind, but because he knows most hearts have too many gears already. His clocks, however, are not the kind that tell time. They are the kind that remind you you don't need to follow it. One rainy evening, as leaves fell in slow motion like feathers drifting from some sky-bound pillow, a traveler came to the edge of the forest. Her name was Nell. She had walked too long, thought too fast, slept too little. Her shoes were muddied, her scarf was damp. Inside her chest, a ticking had started days ago, a silent, invisible desperation, like she was late for something always, even when there was nothing she needed to do. She came to the edge of the woods, not looking for peace, but hoping the world might quiet just enough to hear herself again. The silent forest greeted her with silence, not emptiness, invitation. She stepped in without understanding how far she'd go. The trees didn't rush, the shadows didn't threaten. Squash soft moss covered most of the ground, and the only thing that moved quickly was her breath, until even that began to mimic the quiet between branches. She didn't realize she'd been walking for over an hour. She hadn't meant to walk far or long, but the path, though it had no signs, seemed to open in gentle suggestion, as if the forest was leading her somewhere. That's when she heard it. Tick, soft talk. Not metal, not electric, not measuring time, measuring space between it. She followed it. Without fear, she followed it until she reached a door without a knob, a door with a keyhole shaped like a leaf. She knocked, though she didn't need to. A pulse of warm light glowed beneath the seam. The door opened inwards with a whisper-only hinge, and there, beside a table made of tree rings and clouded glass, Elian looked up and smiled just once. The warmth inside the clockmaker's shop was not just heat, it was time made tender. 1,000 soft ticks and gentle talks filled the room like a lullaby written in sound. There were no harsh metals or flashing faces, no chords or columns, and no consistent ticking from one clock to the next. Instead, it was like walking into a room full of old friends, all breathing in their own rhythm. Nell stood, soaked in the peace of it. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. The silence in the shop wasn't awkward. It was the kind that invites you to pause, notice, rest. Elian, the clockmaker, turned slowly from his table. He wore a coat of thick grey fabric stitched with silver thread. His glasses did not sit on his nose. They floated gently, suspended by a quiet enchantment, tethered to his ears. He looked at her, not with concern or welcome or even surprise, just presence. "You didn't come for a clock," he said at last. His voice was like old velvet, calm, low, dusty but kind. Nell shook her head. She didn't quite know why she'd followed the sound, but now that she was here, she didn't want to leave. "Can I just sit?" Elian nodded once, like slow thunder rolling over distant skies. He gestured with a hand to a round cushion on the floor beside a low table. It bore the lightest trace of floral embroidery, lavender and something else, maybe sage. Nell sat. The warmth in her chest, stirred by the ticking, grew gentler. She listened. Tick, tock, tick, tack. Some strokes came like heartbeats, others like breath. Some ticked every few seconds, some once a minute, and some didn't tick at all, but glowed and dimmed like a breathing old tree in sunlight. She turned toward one of them, the largest timepiece in the room. It hung on the wall near Elian's seat. The shape was round but imperfect. The outer ring made of driftwood, softened by years of ocean wear, and the face, it was made only of colored glass. Each pane shimmered in a different shade of blue and gray, raindrop blue, morning mist, the silver of river stone. The hands didn't move in straight circles, but in soft spirals, gliding just behind the glass, like leaves drifting on invisible water. And it didn't tick, but it hummed softly. "That's the clock of breaths," Elian said, watching her watch it. "It doesn't keep time, it listens to it." "How?" she asked, her voice almost lost to the room's silence. "Each person who comes here leaves a single sigh. This clock remembers them all and breathes one back each night. So no breath is ever truly forgotten. Nell blinked slowly. The one I hear now might be yours. She stood, walking softly from one motion-filled marvel to the next, a clock that resembled a lantern, its pendulum a teardrop full of stardust, another shaped like a tree ring, its marks notched by the age of every story told nearby. One was a puzzle box that never opened but always turned, and each person saw a different pattern within. "These are beautiful," Nell whispered. Elian nodded. "They are not beautiful because of how they look," he said softly. "They are beautiful because of what they leave behind." At the edge of the room she found something else, a small table lower than her knees. Upon it sat many small clocks, broken, unfinished, or paused. Their sounds were slower, uncertain. "What are these?" she asked. He answered without delay. "These are the clocks of those still learning how to stop rushing." She looked up, feeling as if her entire chest had just let go of something invisible. "I think I'm one of them." Elian smiled, not with his mouth, but with the room. The light flickered an inch warmer. A faint chime rang from no visible bell. She reached toward one of the small, broken clocks. It looked like it was carved from old sea glass and bird bone. Trembling slightly, it glowed when she touched it. "I remember this feeling," she whispered. He didn't ask what. He didn't need to. When she looked up again, Elian had turned to the back wall, where there was no clock at all, just a space lined with shelves, paper, and dust, and a small, square nook carved directly out of the wall. "Would you like to try making one?" he asked. Nell swallowed. Her throat was warm and full and a little trembling. "Me? All clocks mark time, but the best clocks mark stillness. You arrived with too much time in your chest. Let's see what it wants to become." She stepped forward slowly, feet soft on old pine floorboards, fingertips brushing worn paper, smooth stones, beads of misted glass arranged in a jar. What if it's not perfect? Nothing is, not even time. In that shop, among clocks that listened and watched, Nell began to gather materials. Not to craft something urgent, not to measure minutes, but simply to create space for what she'd left behind, for what she might become. He placed it gently on an open shelf made from fog-faded pine, and there it would remain, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder that time is not just what we follow, it's what we feel, what we remember, and what we are allowed to rest inside. After a few more hours in that dream-like workshop, choosing parts like memories, not tools, Nell leaned back with her clock in her lap. Her eyes were soft now, heavy in the calm. Her breath no longer rushed out of her, and her shoulders, unconsciously, had stopped hovering near her ears. The room remained wrapped in its quiet song of ticks and low tones, like slow breathing. Outside, the forest pulsed with blue-grey softness. Fog hung around every branch, and moonlight spilled through the trees in thin, glowing threads. It was nearly sleep. Elian had moved to a musical corner of the room, where stringed instruments with no names sat covered in bottles of light. Without use, they simply waited like sleeping cats. But then, bong, low, wide, bong, a second one, slower than the first. Both sounds entered the space, not like a shock, but like a wave, like a stone thrown into a nearly still lake, silent at the edges, deep at the center. Nell sat up. The vibrations bloomed in her chest. She looked at Elian, who had paused mid-step, a piece of soft string in one hand. "What was that?" she whispered. He turned, his expression expression was not afraid, but something older than surprise passed across his face. "That is the midnight bell." She waited for more. It came. "It only strikes when someone cannot fall asleep alone." "Someone here in the forest?" Elian nodded, then looked up toward the half-moon window over the workshop's round front door. "The silent forest rarely forgets a dreamer." Nell rose. She clutched her little unfinished clock gently. It was still warm. The bell rang a final time. Boom! Then silence again, but not the silence of rest, the silence of need. Nell didn't speak. It was as if the sound had asked a question she hadn't realized she could answer. She walked softly toward the door. Elian joined her, but offered no guidance, just presence, which seemed to be his way. He opened the round-topped wooden door, and the night air rushed in, cool, damp, sweet with moss. She paused beneath the starless sky. Something invisible tugged at her sleeves. "You can find them," Elian said quietly behind her. "The forest will show the path, but only if you don't try too hard to see it." Nell clutched the warm clock gently to her chest, then stepped forward into the trees. She thought there would be a path, maybe lanterns or some trail of silver frost like something from a storybook. But instead there were breaths of light, tiny ones, flickers among the leaves, flashing once, then vanishing like echoes of fireflies. Each time she saw one, she took a step toward it, trusting the hush, the promise of that low bell, and an instinct in her legs that said, "Keep walking, you are wanted." Time passed the way it does in dreams, without shape. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 100, and then Nell found it, a hollow in the trees, shaped like a bowl, dotted in soft ferns and silvery moss. At the center, wrapped in the fluff of fallen pine needles and a single glowing feathered shawl, lay a child, small, no older than 6 or 7, curled not in fear, but half trapped between waking and weeping. His eyes were closed too tightly, his hands curled like claws under his chin. He stirred softly, face twitching, not in rhythm, but rattled. Even in the sacred stillness of the silent forest, he could not sleep. Nell stood still, the clock pressed to her ribs. Then it ticked. Just once, and then again, a rhythm began to spill from her hands. Her clock, unfinished, imperfect, was ready now, not to tell time, but to offer something else entirely. A tone, a warmth, a rhythm buried so deep in gentleness it soothed simply by being near. She stepped quietly forward and knelt beside the boy. Without needing to understand why, she placed the strange little clock beside him. It hummed, not tick, not chime, just resonance, like the exact sound 2 heartbeats make when they become one. The boy's breath slowed, hands loosened, eyelids softened from strain into surrender. He didn't wake, he didn't speak, he just let go. And the silent forest, every bough and branch and buried root exhaled. Nell curled beside him, unsure if she was supposed to leave or stay, but her body decided for her. There, beside someone else's rest, she felt her own return. Her eyes fluttered shut, her limbs loosened into the moss. The last thing she heard was not the wind, but 1,000 clocks, each ticking inside silence. The light through the trees came not as sunlight, but as something older, gentler, a cool grey glow, like a memory of morning. It filtered down in long threads, brushing across moss and pine needles, waking the woods without ever disturbing them. Nell stirred. Even before her eyes opened, she felt the difference. the kind of stillness that wasn't emptiness but completion. She blinked slowly. Birdsong did not greet her, but somewhere, far off, a single chime rang out. She sat up. The glade around her was quiet again. The child, the boy wrapped in the shawl, was gone, not vanished, not missing, just not here anymore, but in his place. A trail of soft white feathers, dusted in dew, lay curved across the moss, like a little thank you, a bow, a marking of grace. Nell reached for one, gently cradling it in her fingers. It felt not like down, not like warmth, but like relief. She stood slowly, body tingling with rest, not the kind that comes from sleep, but that deeper kind, the unburdening kind, the kind that settles in the chest after something unnamed has been released. She stepped carefully back through the trees. This time there were no flickers of firefly lights, no guiding winds, but she knew the way without being told. The very earth beneath her feet seemed to welcome her home. When she reached Elian's workshop again, the small round windows were aglow with soft amber. The clocks inside ticked quietly, respectfully, tones muted like whispers in a chapel. Elian stood in the doorway, watching her approach. He held a mug in one hand. The steam swirled into shapes that never repeated. Clouds, leaves, moons, sleeping cats. "He found sleep, didn't he?" he said, not asking, just knowing. Nell nodded. The clock worked. Of course it did. She glanced to her side, remembering the strange, half-finished device she had left beside the boy. "Do I get it back?" Elian smiled faintly. "Some clocks are meant to stay where they're used. That one kept time just long enough for him to forget it again. That's its job." Nell nodded. That felt true. Inside the shop, not much had changed, except everything had. The air was thicker now, not heavy, just rich, the way a room feels after tears have fallen and kindness has stayed behind to catch their echo. Clocks ticked at newer intervals. The clock of breaths gleamed a shade brighter in the corner. Nell stood in the middle of the room, looking around with the careful gaze of someone who knows better than to touch something twice. Her fingers found the worn cushion again. She sat down slowly, tucking one of the boy's white feathers into her coat pocket beside a piece of her own story clock. Elian sat too, not across, not behind, just near. "Why doesn't the forest let people sleep sometimes?" she asked quietly. "It's not the forest that stops them," Elian replied. "It's the sounds they bring with them, the noise in their heads, not just thoughts. Time itself makes noise, you know." Elian motioned to a pale pine clock on a high shelf. It swung once every 5 minutes. "There are people who spend their whole lives trying to catch up to time, and those who run from it." He looked at Nell. "But the forest teaches you this. You don't have to chase it. You can sit with it, let it notice you. And the boy, he just needed someone whose clock wasn't ticking too loudly." Nell smiled, small and sure. She touched her coat pocket. The clock was gone now, yes, but not lost. It had entered the forest, was part of it now, part of the rhythm, the hush, the healing place where time is not kept but felt. Elian stood again. He walked toward a very narrow shelf behind the hearth. There, resting like sacred things in a storybook, were other feathers, some grey, some blue, some with patterns like maps or memories. He added the one Nell had carried, gently, carefully, then closed the case. "Another dreamer remembered," he said. "Will I forget again?" Nell asked after a while. The question was honest, not fearful, just curious. Yes, Elian said softly. Some forgetting is part of being awake. He sat down beside her. The warmth rose from the fire, curling like comfort around her spine. But you'll remember faster next time. How do you know? Because your clock still ticks, even when it's not with you. Nell didn't speak for a long time. The clocks ticked, the light faded, the trees outside stood still, and within her chest, far behind ribs and thoughts and stories still forming, she heard it tick, tick, a rhythm she could rest inside, a sound that wasn't keeping her on task, but keeping her close to herself, the kind of sound you fall asleep beside. That night, as the forest pulled its velvet covers back over itself, Elian stirred a pot of thick tea made from cedar leaves, dried licorice bark, and something cool-tasting Nell couldn't name. The two of them sat near a quiet fire in the workshop's smallest room, a space shaped like a tree hollow, all curved walls and rounded edges. The flames crackled softly like forgotten words settling into peace. Nell cradled her mug between her palms, legs curled beneath her, wrapped in a heavy moss-green shawl Elian had draped across her shoulders earlier. She was thinking, but not urgently, just longingly. "There's a clock I've never seen in your shop," she said, tracing the rim of her cup. "There are many," Elian replied, not smiling but kindling. He turned, placed the lid on the tea, and settled himself into the floor cushions across from her. His knees cracked once. The sound earned no apology. Then came the silence again, familiar now, soft, not heavy. "You said some clocks aren't made for people," she said. "What are they made for? For seasons, for tides, for dreams that have to wait, and one for the world." Nell lifted her eyes. His gaze met hers deliberately. "It's called the Thunder Clock." The fire popped, as if it had heard the name too. It felt loud to say it aloud, not scary, but deep, the kind of deep that doesn't answer questions, only opens them wider. "Is it real?" Nell whispered. "As real as sleeping," said Elian. He leaned back slightly and glanced at the ceiling, where soft ropes of dried moss hung like slow settling rain. "It isn't in this part of the forest," he continued. "Where is it?" "Beneath the mountain that hums." "There's a humming mountain, only when no one listens." And despite the riddle-like answer, Nell understood, because the forest, it was like that. It didn't reveal itself through attention, it unfolded through stillness. Elian sipped his tea, sighed, and looked into the fire. "The thunder clock doesn't mark hours," he said, "and it doesn't mark days." "Then what?" "Balance." Nell tilted her head slightly. "Between the kind of time humans carry on their backs and the kind nature carries in its bones. Is it broken?" Elian didn't answer right away. He looked toward the small window carved in the upper corner of the room. Outside it, barely visible, an old tree's highest limbs swayed gently, in perfect rhythm with nothing, and yet with everything. "Not broken," Elian said at last, "but disturbed." Nell set her tea down, eyes still searching. "Will you go to it?" she asked. "I may have to." "Why?" He turned toward her fully. His voice was soft but edged with knowing. "Because if that clock ticks too fast, everything else starts to forget how to rest." Nell felt it in her ribs, the places under her collarbone still learning to loosen. "Do the trees know?" "Of course," Elian said with the faintest of smiles. "They've already begun dreaming louder, so the clock remembers there's still time." Then silence again, not because there was nothing else to say, but because too much said aloud spoils a truth still blooming. Nell leaned her head against a cushion and let the warmth of the fire wrap slowly into her thoughts. The thunder clock beneath a mountain that hummed when forgotten, a timekeeper for the ticking underneath everything. She wondered, had she felt it in her own life, those days when the world seemed to race without her, when the seasons blurred and no one noticed spring had folded into without catching its breath. "Will you take me?" she asked softly, without knowing she was going to. Elian didn't smile, and he didn't say yes. He just looked down into his now empty teacup and said, "When it's time." And just then a small clock on the wall let out a single chime, not sharp, not clear, almost like a throat clearing from somewhere in the future. And then the fire blinked low, the forest leaned in a little closer, and even the stars outside paused, just long enough to listen. Night is different in the silent forest. It doesn't fall, it settles like frost on windows, or the way a warm blanket releases air as it's draped across sleeping shoulders. Inside the clockmaker's shop, the fire had dimmed into glowing coals, the tea had gone cold, and Nell had curled up in the chair without fully intending to sleep. But sleep had found her anyway, not the kind she usually knew, the one that knocked her over like exhaustion and left her waking with a sore neck and too many thoughts. No, this was drift sleep, the slow kind, the kind that only comes when the wind stops offering directions and the world says, "Stay here, you've done enough." And from within that sleep came a dream. It began with a sound, tick-tock. But unlike the clocks she had heard in Elian's workshop, this one sounded grainy, old, like a clock deep in a canyon, worn by centuries of wind, and behind it another sound, soft, ringing, layered, not repeating but growing, almost like hearing a choir warm up across several hills. Then came images, but not pictures exactly, more like textures of memory, the smooth skin of a river stone, the grain of unpainted wood freshly cut, the warmth of a coat after it's been hanging near a fire, the sting of forgotten tears on a cold face. Merged with those feelings was a location, a mountain, or the memory of one, moss-like velvet, caves in the shape of vowels, trees that leaned toward its chest as if listening to its breath. At the mountain's base, something glowed, not white, not yellow, something between time and flame, a clock face without numbers, etched into the ground itself, surrounded by roots, and just above it hung in mist a bell, only it didn't chime, it breathed. In the dream, Nell reached out her hand to touch the bell, but just before her fingertips met the surface, she woke. The first sound she heard was the whisper of rain against the roof, a soft drizzle, as if even the sky had joined the forest in its determined quiet. She blinked into the dim room. Elian wasn't there, but on the small table beside her cushion, a folded piece of cloth wrapped inside, a single silver pine needle, a stone shaped like a comma, and a tiny paper clock drawn in ink she didn't recognize. Nothing written, no note, but the meaning whispered around her anyway. "You're not the only one who heard it." She stood slowly still, letting the dream fade the way mist disappears from morning leaves, then walked barefoot onto the wooden floor, each step silent, each breath met with warmth. The crackle of one single clock chiming near the door told her two things. One, Elian was gone. Two, but not far, her dream wasn't just a dream, it was a call, and she was starting to believe it had called both of them. She looked out the half-circle window. No movement, no bells, just fog pockets between trees, and the low, knowing hum that comes when you feel something waiting just out of sight. Whatever the next step was, it hadn't arrived yet, but she was ready now, sleep still tangled in her limbs, the dream still a little warm behind her eyes, and her heart not nervous, open like the soft tick of a new clock starting for the very first time. The forest was speaking again, not with words, not with birdsong, but with direction. Nell stood at the edge of the workshop, cloak over her shoulders, her hands warm around the small bundle Elian had left her. The pine needle, the comma-shaped stone, the miniature paper clock drawn in unfamiliar ink, they pulsed faintly in her palm. She knew now this was no dream response. It was a trailhead, the kind that doesn't appear on maps, but begins inside a decision. She hadn't heard Elian return, and he wasn't inside when she checked again. The hearth was still warm, and if a clock could sigh, the one above the mantel had done so. "He's already started walking," she whispered, not disappointed, not startled, just ready. She stepped outside. The morning, if you could call it that, was more mist than light. No sky swathes of blue, just layers of soft grey, folded gently over the world like bed sheets over forgetful dreams. The trees stood calm and knowing, beaded with dewdrops like glass pearls. A few leaves drifted downward, spiraling in lazy corkscrews, landing with the sound of thoughts fading, and beneath her boots the earth felt different, not firmer, not looser, but aware, as if the roots below were watching her without concern, just waiting to see if she knew the way. But she didn't, not really, and yet her feet moved forward anyway. She passed the round stump marker near Elian's garden, the one that hadn't been there yesterday. Now carved into its softened top was a swirl shaped just like the stone she carried. When she placed the stone into the groove, not as a key, but as an acknowledgement, moss along the edge of the stump pulled back ever so slightly, not revealing a tunnel, not opening some secret door, just pointing to a narrow space between trees where bark leaned toward bark, and a small curve of forest unfolded like an opening eye. She stepped through into what could only have been part of the route path, the forest's inner circle. Here the light was deeper, here the dirt was soft with centuries, and here Nell began to see them, clocks, not above, but below, imprinted on the roots and trunks like natural tattoos, some large, with grooves shaped like spiral galaxies, others the size of coins, breathing from moss. None of them ticked, not out loud, but when her ear drifted near, she heard stories like old, slow dreams someone had folded into the bark. She crouched near one knotted root and pressed her hand against it. Words arrived in her mind, not spoken, but known. Here, a girl once wept for an hour beneath this tree, and the tree wept back. Another clock, this one tooth-marked and hollowed halfway, gave her a feeling of music long ago lost, and yet another seemed to pulse with warmth like the inside of a remembered hug. It was not a straight trail, more like a sequence, a rhythm revealed one step at a time, as though the forest had no interest in her destination, only in the pace of her presence. After nearly an hour of quiet moving, watching, listening, she found the second token's resting place, a small alcove in a wide birch tree, shaped like a comma, bark peeled just enough to suggest intention. when she placed the comma-shaped stone inside it. The ground beneath her feet vibrated just once. From deep below, a hum, low, weightless, not ominous, more like a reminder that something old had noticed her. She looked up. No birds, but overhead the branches curved to something distant, a direction so faint she might have missed it. But this was how the forest spoke, not by marking the way, but by asking if your rhythm was willing to match its own. She continued on. With each step, the trees began whispering in new ways. Leaves no longer just rustled, they breathed. The wind didn't push, it guided. And when she reached a hollow space lined with stone, she realized she had returned not to a place, but to a way of being, the part of herself that once wandered barefoot, that once gathered moss for no reason during childhood walks, the self who knew how to walk just to feel her feet moving. Near the edge of the clearing, a final marker waited. It was rough, it had no clean edges, carved not by hand, but shaped by something ancient. Inside, there was only a small, curled, pine needle. She placed the one from Elian in its center. A gust of wind spun in a slow circle around her legs, and the ground opened. Not a hole, not a frightening thing, simply a shift, a door that didn't exist until she arrived at exactly the right moment in her own pace. A glowing pulse from beneath the soil, a hum, the same note from her dream. The thunder clock was waiting, not urgent, not loud, just listening, wondering, would she come all the way, not to fix, but to feel. And she stepped forward, one boot, then the other, into the breathing roots, toward time, not measured, but remembered. The deeper she walked, the less time seemed to matter. There was no up or down, no before or after, only movement, measured not in steps, but in feeling. The roots above her head formed a kind of soft cathedral. They arched like the ribs of whales, glowing faintly where they thinned. The earth underfoot was warm, firm, and silent except for the faintest sound. A tick, one, then another. But this wasn't the ticking of a pocket watch. It was much slower. Each tick came like a distant drumbeat across some invisible canyon, soft, steady, low, and between the ticks the hum grew louder. Nell kept walking. She'd stopped wondering how far she had to go. She was already there, in the way arrival sometimes happens gradually, like fog lifting off your mind. She stepped into a clearing, not of trees, not even of forest, but of stone, a round chamber carved not by hands but by time itself, wide circular walls that shimmered with mineral light. Inside, thin vines like sky-colored threads traced along the edges, swaying to a rhythm she hadn't noticed until now. And at the center, a raised platform of black stone, low, circular, etched with a clock face of no numbers. Instead, it bore symbols she didn't recognize: a sleeping eye, a wilted leaf floating upward, a spiral wrapped inside a raindrop, and others even more mysterious. And there, just above it, the thunder clock. It was breathtaking, twice the size of Elian's largest wall clock, but you wouldn't know it just by looking, because it didn't shout for attention. It simply was. It floated, not hung, spun slowly, not in precise circles, but in pulses, like breathing. Its surface shimmered deep metallic black, and the hand, if you could call it that, was made of light. It didn't point, it drifted, and every now and then a tick sounded across the chamber. When it did, the walls seemed to react, shifting slightly, adjusting, like lungs inhaling just enough, but something felt wrong only slightly. The ticks were too close together, not enough space between them, not frantic, not dangerous, but just enough that if someone were really listening, they'd know. Time was leaning forward, and time in this place wasn't for keeping appointments or catching trains. This time was for keeping balance. Nell approached slowly. As she reached the edge of the platform, her own breath synchronized, she noticed, and in some stored up place inside her chest, the feeling of old worry returned, that modern, quiet panic called, "Am I late for something I don't understand?" But she stepped closer anyway. She didn't touch it, didn't need to. Instead, she placed her palm flat on the stone at the base of the clock, and suddenly images, thoughts not her own, but truthful in a strange way. She saw a sapling growing so slowly it counted sunrise like notes in a song, a turtle dreaming for a full season, untouched by urgency, a child watching snow fall, measuring time in the silence between flakes hitting the window, and then 1,000 hurried feet on pavement, light changing colors too fast to register, minds spinning like unanchored clocks with no centers. She opened her eyes. Her breath was fast again. "The world forgot how to pause," she whispered, not accusing, just observing, and when she did, the thunder clock paused too, just one tick longer than before, not much, but enough, and from the far side of the glowing chamber, within the arch of old carved stone, a shape appeared, coat grey, hood up, eyes knowing. Elian. He walked slowly, as always, like his feet were in rhythm with the breath of the forest. No hurry, but no delay. He stepped beside her, said nothing immediately. Together they watched the thunder clock drift in gentle pulses. Then, finally, "You heard it too?" she asked. Elian nodded. "I've been listening to it since before my footsteps matched its beat." She looked up at him. "Can we fix it?" "It doesn't need fixing," he said. "It needs remembering. It needs someone to notice it again." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, soundless but solid. "Then we remind it how to slow." "No," Elian said softly, pointing toward her chest. "You remember, that's all it needs." She felt it now, the pulsing beat in the stone, in the light, in her ribcage. There was no tool to turn, no switch to flip, no ancient lever to pull, to realign the thunder clock. She simply had to match it, breathe with it, hold still long enough to mean it. So Nell did. She knelt by the platform, closed her eyes, and began to breathe, slow, deliberate, truthful, nothing to solve, nothing to earn, only a rhythm between her chest and somewhere deeper, older than time, in the silence that followed. The next tick took just a moment longer to arrive, then another, further still. The thunder clock was listening back. The moment stretched, not in length, but in depth. The thunder clock did not tick again right away. Instead, the cavern filled with something that wasn't sound at all. It was something you feel when a storm is nearby, not yet arrived, not even seen, but sensed in your chest just below the breath. The pause between ticks. Nell remained kneeling beside the clock's massive stone base, hands pressed to its surface, one palm open, one resting lightly on her chest. Her breathing was slow, so slow in fact she could almost hear it inside her, the not quite a sound of lungs rolling in and out like quiet waves. Above her, the thunder clock's glowing hand circled only slightly in a broad arc, casting crescent shadows on the walls. No gears moved, no pendulum swung, yet somehow it pulsed, soft light, warmth with no source. She felt still, not trapped, not frozen, but steadily noticed. And then the cavern shifted, not physically, more like the air folded over itself and time tucked its elbows in. Nell's surroundings blurred, not violently, not jarringly, but like one thought layered gently over another. She was still in the cavern, but also somewhere else. She did not float, she didn't fall, but perspective changed around her, like a telescope sliding from her present moment backward through forgotten lenses, her body no longer rigid in place. She moved, though her feet did not step. The thunderclock's hum slowed and deepened, and what came next was a memory not hers. She stood in a field, spring. The air was sweeter here, thick with blossom scents and creek song. Before her, a woman with silver braids sitting on a round blanket, sewing something by hand. It looked like a ribbon woven from strands too fine to be thread, almost like time stretched thin. The woman didn't see Nell, not exactly, but she paused in her stitching. "Child of now," she said aloud without looking up. "You are visiting the meantime." "What's that?" Nell asked softly. "The room between seconds, like the pause between ticks." The woman chuckled peacefully. "Not a gap, a gathering. You're here because the great clock trusts you." Nell sat beside her, though she wasn't sure how or when she had moved. The field rippled not with wind, but with rhythm. Everything here moved in slow meaning. The trees didn't sway, they agreed. The blades of grass bowed to each step of time. The ribbon in the woman's hands shimmered with colors Nell didn't have names for. "Do you know Elian?" she asked. The woman paused, considered, then smiled. "He was once a guest of the meantime, too. He's walked longer than most magic has lasted." "Is the thunder clock breaking?" "Not breaking," the woman said, just out of breath. "What happens if it runs too fast?" The woman rested her hands in her lap. Eyes finally rose to meet Nell's. "Then people forget sunsets last longer if you watch them. That pies cool slower when you dance. That goodbyes don't need to feel like erasing." Nell felt something in her chest ripple, gratitude, not for understanding everything, but for being shown just enough. "You're not meant to stay," the woman said calmly. "Even the meantime is made to pass through. No memory lasts when the rhythm picks up again. Will I forget this?" "No," she said kindly. "You'll just remember it differently." And then a tick, one, soft, so low it might have been mistaken for the beat of a soft drum. She looked up, the field blurred, the woman faded, ribbon still curling between her fingers as gently as breath, and in one blink Nell was back beneath the mountain that hummed at the base of the thunder clock, eyes open, hands still resting against stone, and in the next moment a second tick arrived, further apart than any she had heard before. Like a sigh of gratitude, she turned slightly, and Elian was sitting beside her in the chamber now, as quiet as if he'd always been there. He looked at her, eyes unreadable, but filled with a quiet, shimmering trust. "You danced with the pause," he said. Nell nodded slowly. She called it the meantime. "Did she now?" he whispered, with the smile of someone who'd heard that name before but hadn't spoken it out loud for many years. The thunder clock's hand drifted, hovering near a symbol of a fern unfurling, and Nell knew they hadn't stopped anything, they hadn't fixed time, they had simply reminded it how to be still, just enough, and in the stone silent chamber that only moved when listened to. The clocks waited and the world breathed. They didn't speak much on the journey back up from the thunder clock. Elian walked slightly ahead, his hands tucked calmly into the sleeves of his woven coat. The pathway through the mountain wound like thought, not linear, but true if you trusted it. Nell followed in time with him. She no longer tapped her fingers impatiently. She no longer counted her steps. She simply walked, and with each footfall she matched rhythm with something larger. By the time they emerged back beneath the forest canopy, the mist had fallen again, wrapping around the great roots like silk ribbons. Branches did not creak, they nodded. The leaves no longer rustled, they exhaled. Time had not stopped, it had just remembered how to wait. Back inside the workshop, Elian lit the candles not all at once, but one by one, as if each deserved its very own beginning. Nell stirred a small kettle on the stove top. "It feels different," she said quietly. Elian looked over his shoulder, not with surprise but with agreement. "It is. The thunder clock has slowed only a little. I didn't know time could slow without anything falling apart." "Slower isn't broken," he said. "It's just rare." She poured their tea, some blend of spruce needles and dried orchid seed. It didn't taste of any one thing but of reminder. She took a sip, curled back into her chair and asked, "Are there others like you?" Now Elian smiled, not because he hadn't expected the question. He had, but because it was time to answer. "There are those of us who protect time's stillness," he said, "but there are others who carry it." He stepped toward a worn drawer beneath the mantel, pulled it open from within, a folded swath of parchment tied with a cord made of braided night blue thread. "They're called the Dream Slow Caravan." "What is it?" "Not a place," Elian said. "A people, sleep guides, memory bearers, clocksmiths and tea weavers. Children who never forgot how long a moment lasts when you're really in it." He unwrapped the parchment and laid the map across the table. The lines were not straight. They curved like clouds, loops, swirls, pauses drawn in ink of dusky gold. Iconography danced in the corners, moons nested in spoons, hourglasses inside wagon wheels, birds flying with trails of glowing commas. "They move where they're needed," Elian said, "and only where they're invited." Nell leaned closer. "What do they do?" "At night," he said softly, "they park their wagons on hills, in meadows, near city rooftops. They fill the air with songs shaped like warmth. They repair tears in restless sleep. They whisper lullabies never written down. They leave behind dreams where they're most needed." Nell studied the map. She noticed small markers, dots shaped like stars. "Are those stops?" "No," Elian said. "Those are moments." "Moments?" "Yes. They record slowness. Any time a child falls asleep while listening to snow, or someone lays on a dock and forgets what time they were born." His voice lowered. "They record anything the world forgets to love anymore." Nell ran her fingertip across the inked stars. "Have you ever traveled with them?" For a moment Elian looked very far away. His fingers drifted to a ring on his right hand, a small thing shaped like an eclipse. "Once," he said, "long ago, for one night." "Why only one?" "It's easy to walk like them, but hard to stay that way when the world pulls." Nell was quiet a long time. Then, "I'd like to see them." Elian nodded, as if he'd been waiting for her to say that. He rolled up the parchment, placed it gently in a hollow tube carved from lightning-struck birch, then handed it to her. "You may already be walking toward them. Sometimes it's not about finding, it's about moving slow enough to notice you're already among them. She held the tube. It vibrated softly, not like machinery, more like a heartbeat. Outside, a new wind breathed through the pines. It sounded like chimes made from fog and string. The forest was listening again, but not just to Elian now, to her. And when she stood, the clocks, in their quiet swell of rhythms, adjusted slightly, as if welcoming her, one of them. The fire in the stone hearth had burned low, reduced to a golden cradle of coals whose glow cast drowsy shadows across the room. It was past midnight now, though no clock said so aloud. Nell stood at the edge of Elian's little workshop, warm tea in her belly, wool wrap over her shoulders, the wooden map tube tucked securely at her side. The room hummed with lived-in sleepiness, but something called, not out loud, not urgent, just gently unfinished. Her eyes drifted past the familiar objects, the cluttered table of watch parts, bowls of fog-colored beads, books stacked in sleepy towers, and then she saw it, a clock, but still, no tick, no pulse, nothing. It sat on the highest shelf above the work table, half tucked into the shadows cast by a fat ivory candle that had melted in a spiral. "That one," she said softly, half to herself. "Ah," Elian murmured, not in surprise but understanding. He walked slowly to stand beside her, tilting his head as if re-seeing something he'd grown used to not noticing. "It hasn't moved in years," he said. "Broken?" "No," he said, a tiny smile pulling at his lip. "Just waiting." Nell stepped closer. The clock was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way. Its face was clean, no numbers at all, just 12 faint constellations stitched in silver. Its frame was perfectly round, but made from 3 different woods, ash, sycamore, and driftwood. And in the center, where a small hand might sit, was a keyhole, one with no key in sight. "Does it open?" she asked. "Only when someone gives it a name," Elian replied, his voice lowering, soft in reverence. "The clock isn't made to keep time, it's made to remember it." "Whose time?" "Yours." She looked at him, quietly stunned. "So why hasn't it worked? You've never told it who you are." Nell felt something shift in her chest. All this time she'd been listening to clocks, breathing with them, crafting one of her own, sitting with the thunder clock, and yet silence still lingered in one particular chamber of her heart. Not silence like peace, silence like pause, that deep, expectant kind, that waits for naming. "What happens if I name it?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Then it begins," Elian said, "not with ticking, not with time, but with memory that flows in the right direction." "Do I say the name out loud?" He nodded, but added, "It doesn't have to be the name you use in the world. It's the name that knows you, the one time remembers you by." She looked at the clock again. It wasn't grand or jeweled. It wasn't urgent. It had been waiting a long time. Not asleep, just patient, quiet, and maybe hoping. She closed her eyes, listened. She didn't listen for words. She listened for that feeling you get when you take a long inhale after a long silence and finally remember what's been missing. A word formed, strange, instinctive, beautiful, meaningless to any dictionary, a sound her heart liked. She opened her eyes, felt the breath in her chest swirl, and spoke softly. "Oren." The name echoed, but only inward, Click, the sound was buttery and small, the keyhole lit with a glow as thin as memory, and one single hand of silver appeared in the center of the clock. It pointed nowhere, and then slowly drifted to a cluster of stars inked like a pendant on the far left edge of the dial, a symbol she'd never seen before, but recognized anyway. "That's the night I left," she whispered. Elian laid his hand gently on her shoulder. "It'll remember for you now," he said, quietly. "No ticking, just awareness. How long will it keep time? Only as long as it matters." The clock didn't tick, didn't chime, didn't mark seconds or quarters or hours, but in that moment Nell knew it had begun, not to measure her life, but to be present for it. Whenever she forgot herself, it would remind her, not with alarms, but with echoes, a record of her soul's stillness. She reached up slowly and took the clock from the shelf, held it in both palms. It felt like being held back. "Thank you," she said softly. Elian didn't answer. The room didn't answer. Time didn't answer. But something just beyond sound, just beneath her pulse, glowed, and somewhere in the forest a soft bell rang, not for waking, not for warning, but for welcoming, a new rhythm beginning. Nell sat outside the workshop beneath a sky the color of ink and candlelight. Above, the stars blinked, not in hurried sparkle, but in deep rhythm, slow, thoughtful pulses, like ancient eyes winking once every few centuries. The moon had risen low, soft and thick, more round belly than crescent. It hung just above the treetops, casting faint silver across the clearing. In her lap the named clock rested. Oren, its single hand had not moved since it appeared, still gently aiming at that one symbol, 3 stars in a teardrop ring, the shape of something remembered, not the past exactly, but something important, something true. Small drifting threads began to rise from the moss all around her. At first she thought they were mist or dust from old bark, but in the moonlight they shimmered in faint colors and carried a warmth she recognized, not heat, not even emotion in the usual sense, but closeness, the feeling of someone thinking of you softly from a far-off place. She reached toward the nearest thread. It curved in the air like a ribbon of smoke, then wrapped once around her finger. She didn't grip it. She let it hold her finger for just a moment. And when she closed her eyes, a memory flashed, but it wasn't hers. A child standing in the rain, summer, barefoot, laughing while painting a sidewalk with water. Each stroke dried faster than the next, but she didn't mind. She was painting anyway, because the world deserved small, vanishing beauty. Nell opened her eyes. The thread let go, gently fluttered back into the air, then faded into the soil again. More threads drifted now, some near her arms, some above the clock, some too far to touch but clearly passing through. "Is this magic?" she whispered. A now familiar voice answered from behind. "It's remembering," said Elian, "from those who passed through here. Some were dream caravan, some were not, but all of them left a thread." Nell looked up. "Why are they coming now?" "The forest knows when someone's named themselves," he replied. "It gives you permission to hear more than your own thoughts." "Am I allowed to see other people's memories?" Elian stepped slowly to her side. "Only the ones they were willing to share." He lowered himself beside her and plucked a thread gently from the air. It curled around his knuckle, pulsing once, Then another memory fell open. A quiet man with a pencil behind his ear, sitting beneath a tree and sketching leaves. Not nature drawings, but portraits of leaves, each with their own names. He whispered an apology to one as he turned the page. "Don't worry," he said, "you'll be remembered anyway." The thread let go and vanished. Nell was silent for a long time. Then, "It's beautiful, yes, and easy to miss," said Elian. He stood up again and motioned slightly with a tilt of his chin. "Walk slowly through the trees tonight," he said. "Touch what lights up. Don't pull. Just remember them as you pass." "What does it do?" "It teaches you the world doesn't belong only to your present moment." He paused, then added, "And some dreams are not dreams at all. They're pieces of someone else, still looking for a place to rest." So Nell walked not far, through trees no taller than listening required, past trunks wrapped in moss, through air that felt like sighing language. The threads found her gently, and piece by piece she saw a baker dreaming of a cake made from moonlight, a child asleep in a hammock made of books, two lovers writing letters to the stars because they didn't trust paper. None of it asked her to fix, keep, change, or explain. They asked only to be visited. She returned to the workshop long past what might be midnight. The forest did not mark the hours, only moments. The hearth inside had been replenished, Elian's doing surely, and the cushions were still warm. She curled herself into the chair again. The named clock still ticked softly within her coat pocket. She leaned her head back and whispered, "I think I'm remembering more than what belonged to me." There was no answer, only a faint glow from one last memory thread curling on the edge of her sleeve. It didn't show an image, it played a sound, the voice of someone long ago, humming a lullaby, out of tune but full of love. And then silence, welcoming silence. It was morning, but only technically. The kind of morning you don't see, but feel. A pale blue light slipping quietly between the old glass windows, casting leaf-shaped shadows on the wooden floor. The fog hadn't lifted, it had simply curled further into the roots of the trees, as if the forest was still finishing its dream. Nell sat alone at the table, her hands wrapped around a second cup of Elian's bark tea. The named clock, Orin, ticked faintly on the table beside her. It always ticked when she was touching it, not constantly, just enough to say, "You are here, I am listening." Elian returned from the cellar carrying a small bundle wrapped in a cloth the color of dusk. He said nothing at first, neither did she. He placed the bundle on the table between them, then slowly untied the knot. Inside was a compass, circular, about the width of her palm, made of layered brass, brushed to look like it had been carried through 100 dreams and back. Inside it, no needle, yet it shimmered faintly. A small glass dome sat atop, and within that dome floated a pale silver thread suspended in some kind of liquid that did not slosh or spill. The thread drifted clockwise, then paused, then swayed once to the left. Nell tilted her head. "It doesn't point north," she said softly. "No," Elian replied. "It points toward the next tired soul." Nell blinked, then looked up. "What do you mean?" "That's called a sleepwalker's watch." He folded his hands on the table. "There are only a few of them. Most are in caravans, but this one," he glanced at the shimmer, "hasn't belonged to anyone in a very long time. The thread inside the dome twitched again, shifted, then stilled, not seeking direction, but awaiting decision. It searches, Elian continued softly, not for lost travelers or for clocks that need winding, but for people who have forgotten what it feels like to rest. Nell looked down at the watch again. She didn't need to ask why he was showing it to her. She already knew. But still, she asked, "Why me?" Elian smiled, not in grandness or pride, but like someone finally handing over an heirloom that had waited patiently through generations. "Because you've become quieter than the world. That's not always easy." "No," he said, "but it's always needed." The sleepwalker's watch pulsed again under the glass. No sound, just awareness. "Will I know where it leads me?" "Only if you follow slowly." "Will it wake people?" she asked. "No," said Elian. "You will, or rather, you'll remember for them what they've misplaced inside themselves. You'll sit beside their restless moments, and your presence will speak what clocks cannot." Nell swallowed softly, not fear, not reluctance, just the weight of knowing. This was the next door, and it had opened with no lock. Elian reached beneath the cloth and pulled out a second item, a small pouch tied with vine string. He offered it. Inside are 3 things: a feather for remembering childhood breath, a stone that holds silence even when dropped, and a single piece of night glass collected on the last moonless hour of the year. Use only when the forgetting becomes too loud. He looked at her more carefully now, less like a guide, more like a friend walking the same road from another side. "You won't go alone," he added. "Are you coming with me?" Nell asked. "Not this time. My path is older, yours is beginning. The caravan will feel you soon enough, if you follow." The watch in her hand shifted again, then settled on a direction that led not deeper into the forest, but out of it, toward the rest of the world, the noisy places, the hurried minds, the ticking cities, the bending hearts. She turned toward the window, past the frost on the glass, beyond the trees, to a glimmer of world she hadn't yet walked through slowly, but soon would. "There's no ceremony," Elian said. "I don't need one." "Good." He stood, reached for a jar of jam made from sleep berries and dusted sugar, spread it on a slice of oat bread, wrapped it in brown paper, folded it into her coat pocket without asking. "For the road," he said. "When does it begin?" He stepped toward the door and opened it slowly. A bell tied near the hinge barely made a sound, but the air shifted, the forest brightened by the inch. "It already has." Nell stepped outside, cradling the new compass in her hand. The air met her like a welcome hug from someone who'd always known she was on the guest list, even before she did. And the path, still faint, soft, winding, not a road, not a trail, but a thread kept in motion by following it, slowly opened. Time did not press behind her. Elian did not wave goodbye, but just before she faded from sight between the trees, she heard the clocks from inside the workshop chime, not all at once, not in unison, but like laughter in a far-off room, and it sounded like something you never forget, even when you leave it behind. Cloud. That was Nell's first impression. Not sky, not stone, not path or people, just cloud. It hugged the rooftops like cotton dipped in moonlight. As she passed through the final curve of birch trees, leaving the forest's embrace behind, she reached a hilltop trail overlooking a small settlement tucked into the spine of low mountains and sky-hung meadows. The sun hadn't broken through, but light brewed somewhere behind the cloud bank. The world here looked steeped like tea left to warm for just long enough, and at the center of the village her watch pulsed, faint silver, almost like a heartbeat from beneath water. The path into town was narrow and lined with windrunners, paper-like flags tied with memories instead of ink. Each one whispered softly when you walked past. Some fluttered with laughter, others sighed. A few murmured simple words like soon or enough. Nell slowed down, not because she had to, but because moving slowly felt more natural now. She passed an old wooden gate, drifted beside a sleep-dusted bakery, and spotted a weathered plaque beside a crooked street sign. Welcome to Cloud Haven, where the rooftops have ears and the wind takes notes, charming and accurate. The sleepwalker's watch tugged left, not sharply, just a gentle urge in direction, a nudge like when someone brushes your coat sleeve and steps away silently, trusting you'll know how to follow. She passed quiet homes dressed in curling ivy and soft blue shutters. Even the lampposts looked like they'd rather be napping. People passed her now and then, not many. A few in shawls, one on a bicycle that creaked like a yawn, 2 children racing leaves down a gutter stream, laughing with their eyes closed. Nell nodded to a woman sweeping mist from her porch, and the woman didn't respond with words, only lifted her chin as if to say, "We see you, take your time." The watch pulsed again, stronger, then stopped. Nell did too. She stood in front of a quiet shop, wood shingles dappled with moss, large windows fogged by stories unsaid, and a crooked sign above the door. The Second Moon Bookshop. The door was slightly ajar. A silver bell dangled from a thin chain. Her hand rested on the latch, and in that instant she knew someone inside has been carrying tiredness that doesn't answer to sleep. Inside, the shop smelled like paper, chamomile, and rainy mittens. The warmth was instant, not hot, not scented, just warm. A man, perhaps mid-60s, stood behind the counter with a cup of steam in his hands and a scarf tied 3 times around his neck. He didn't lift his head as she entered, didn't ask if she needed help finding anything, didn't speak. But exhaustion saturated the air around him like dust in sunbeams, not the loud, urgent kind of tiredness, the hollow kind, not broken, just low lit. She walked slowly past shelves of thick tomes and folios with mismatched bindings, books organized not by title or topic, but somehow by temperature. One shelf felt cool and metal sharp, another cozy, like cinnamon in a snowstorm. One, her favorite, felt like standing in someone's childhood attic, holding a box no one had opened in 20 years. The watch tensed, then softened. She knew what to do. Nell picked up a small, thread-bound book with a blank spine, flipped past a few empty pages, and found one that shimmered faintly. She held her palm over it. A memory thread emerged, almost grey, almost weightless, and she saw it. A younger version of the bookseller sitting on a park bench, a girl beside him, perhaps 10 years old, drawing in crayon on napkins. He speaks gently to her. "We'll build a bookshop someday, you and me, and we'll call it The Second Moon, because stories deserve more than one chance to shine." She laughs, tugs at his sweater sleeve, and drops her drawing. Then the memory fades, not because it ends, but because that's where he stopped remembering it with joy. Nell blinked softly. The bookseller still hadn't spoken, still hadn't moved, but the room wrapped around him as if listening for something he could no longer say. aloud. She walked back to the front desk, placed the book gently beside his elbow, and waited until he finally, slowly, looked at her. His expression flickered, not with surprise, but with a softness long buried. "You dreamed of this place with someone," she said quietly, "but somewhere you forgot how to dream for yourself." He didn't ask how she knew. He just closed his eyes, and his shoulders, always lifted, held, braced, fell, not in collapse, but in release. That night, the sign above the shop was cleaned for the first time in years. A tiny candle was lit in the window, and a book no one remembered owning was placed in the front display. Its title read, "For When You Need a Second Moon," and the quiet village slept a little deeper. The atmosphere in Cloudhaven never fully cleared. Even when morning arrived, it came with mist braided into its sleeves. The clouds didn't lift. They simply leaned away, like friends giving space to something important. The sleepwalker's watch rested quiet in Nell's pocket, but pulsed faintly still, not urgently, not with direction, just with a kind of heartbeat rhythm. Pause. Wait. Here. Just here. That afternoon, Elian's map softly unfurled itself while Nell sat at the edge of the town's weathered overlook. She hadn't opened it. It had done so on its own. The thread lines curved across soft parchment like a constellation of paths and pauses. At the top edge, a golden thread marked Whispering Pass, and two notations in grainy script beside little wind symbols. They don't speak unless the wind already has. No, let the silence become your question. Well, that was mysterious, but by now Nell had come to trust paths that asked her to slow down. She walked north, just past the last cottage where wind chimes hung like sleeping music and rose vines curled around iron gates that never clanged. The path curved uphill where low shrubs wore beads of fog and tree branches bowed toward the trail like they knew she was coming. And then she heard it, a flute-like wailing sound, not human, not machine, almost bagpipes, no, windpipes, the mountain singing through stone. And there, perched on a flat ledge overlooking a great swoop of wilderness, two figures, twins, dressed in wool coats with leaf stitching. Their hair matched, not in style or color, but in air, like their heads had always leaned the same way during snowfall. The atmosphere in Cloudhaven never fully cleared. Even when morning arrived, it came with mist braided into its sleeves. The clouds didn't lift, they simply leaned away, like friends giving space to something important. The sleepwalker's watch rested quiet in Nell's pocket, but pulsed faintly still, not urgently, not with direction, just with a kind of heartbeat rhythm. Pause. Wait. Here. Just here. That afternoon, Elian's map softly unfurled itself while Nell sat at the edge of the town's weathered overlook. She hadn't opened it. It had done so on its own. The thread lines curved across soft parchment like a constellation of paths and pauses. At the top edge, a golden thread marked Whispering Pass, and two notations in grainy script beside little wind symbols. They don't speak unless the wind already has. Let the silence become your question. Well, that was mysterious, but by now Nell had come to trust paths that asked her to slow down. She walked north just past the last cottage where wind chimes hung like sleeping music and rose vines curled around iron gates that never clanged. The path curved uphill where low shrubs wore beads of fog, and tree branches bowed toward the trail like they knew she was coming. And then she heard it, a flute-like wailing sound, not human, not machine, almost bagpipes, no, windpipes, the mountain singing through stone. And there, perched on a flat ledge overlooking a great swoop of wilderness, two figures, twins, dressed in wool coats with leaf stitching. Their hair matched, not in style or colour, but in air, like their heads had always leaned the same way during snowfall. No speaking, no checking time, no planning, just exhale, and let the wind finish your sentences for once. When she finally turned to go, no one watched her leave, but the wind shifted once, against her spine, not a push, a path. As she returned to Cloudhaven, her watch glowed softly against her coat. She knew now. The caravan didn't speak aloud, it didn't knock, it didn't even arrive with footsteps. It folded itself into your pace when you slowed enough to let it, and just before she returned to town, she looked up and saw, high above, between clouds and sky, a caravan lantern drifting in air, pulled by nothing, lit from within, and bright enough only for those who needed to see it. The lantern above her pulsed like a breath held aloft. Nell stood at the edge of the next path. No signs, no stones, only the soft tug of the watch in her coat pocket, and a strange lightness in her limbs, like the air itself had become cozy. No voice told her to move forward, but her feet did. They remembered before words could. The forest opened slowly. The trees didn't part like grand doors. They receded like a hush moving deeper into itself. And before she knew it, she stood at the edge of a great wide field. It stretched in soft hills, covered in silvery grass that bent even without wind. Mist moved low across the ground, and overhead lanterns floated, not on poles, not on strings, just drifting in long, slow arcs, like jellyfish in deep sky. They glowed in soft shades, amber, lavender, pearl, each one pulsing faintly. They made no sound, but somehow filled the air with comfort, like music that sits behind the ears, hugging instead of playing. Nell stepped into the field. The moment she did, her breath deepened. It wasn't voluntary, just aligned. Her ribs softened, her steps slowed, her thoughts, well, they stepped out of the way, not gone, just farther back, as if her worries and plans chose a seat under a nearby tree to wait. As she walked forward into a space made entirely of needed forgetting, at the center of the field she saw them, just a few people, not groups, just individuals or pairs, each spread out among the hills, sitting, laying down, one resting on their side, fingers tangled in dew-touched grass. None of them looked up, no one waved, no voices whispered, but she felt it. Each of them had brought something here to lay down, not grief, not memories, but mental noise, buzzing clocks between heartbeats, spinning questions that never get answered, to-do lists tattooed behind closed eyes. In this place, they let it go, for a minute, for an hour, maybe for good. Nell sat near the lowest lamp. It hovered 3 feet above the ground. Its glow was blue at the edges and gold at the center. She reached out a hand, not to touch it, but to simply be near, and as soon as she did, it responded. A warm ripple spread through the field. It wasn't visual, it wasn't even physical, just a shared slowing, like all the air had remembered to exhale. One woman 50 yards away began to weep, not sorrowfully, gratefully. Another man laughed, once, quietly, like forgetting something painful had made space for something gentle. The lanterns swayed, not in time, but in acceptance. Nell closed her eyes. She didn't ask to forget anything, but she said, "Take what I don't want to carry by accident." And the hill pulsed under her legs, as if the earth agreed to hold what she could not. She stayed there until dusk bowed gently across the field, and the lanterns began to rise higher, ready to carry what they'd gathered, not away, but up into dreamlight, where forgetting wears softer shoes. When she turned to go, she passed a stretch of grass pressed down by a body that had already left, not trampled, just sat in deeply, and pinned there, left on purpose, a folded note. She picked it up, unfolding it gently. The handwriting was slow, imperfect, honest. "I forgot thinking was optional. Thank you for reminding me." No name, just starlight dripped in ink. Nell stepped to the edge of the field and looked back. It looked bigger now, but she was no longer trying to take it with her. She had learned sometimes the most generous thing a place can do is let you leave without bringing the noise back. Above her, one last lantern paused overhead. It flashed once, faster than the rest. Recognition. It saw her and drifted upward, carrying a small bit of her silence with it, not as weight, but as offering. The road narrowed again, not with trees this time, but with sky. The clouds hung low in the evening light, not heavy, but velvet thick, folding layer by layer, like curtains pulled to mark the final act of a story. Nell followed the last pulse of the sleepwalker's watch. It no longer nudged or tugged, it simply invited. The rhythm of it had synced so wholly with her own that she could barely tell where it began and her steps ended, and at the crest of a gentle rise in the land, she saw them. Or rather, she noticed what was already there. It hadn't arrived. It had always been waiting, set into the open curve of a sprawling plain, among soft swells of moss-dotted earth and still-breathing trees, was the dream-slow caravan. No wagons jostled, no fire cracked, no wind snapped fabric into noise. The scene was hushed, but glowing. Wagons stood in a circle, their wood carved with moons and measures, each painted in colours the forest approved of, dream tones of sage, lavender smoke, warm rust, deep sea. Beaded curtains swayed with air so light it never touched your skin. Some wagons had lanterns on their roofs, others grew live moss in their windows. One, entirely covered in mirrors, reflected the clouds as though holding them up from below. And the people, they moved in rhythm you could only feel, not quick, not idle. Each step was purposeful, slow, like they walked not through time, but with it. No one bowed when Nell arrived. No one greeted her with gasps or headlines. Instead, a woman with a braid draped over one shoulder simply smiled and nodded. Nell returned the nod. It felt like the only greeting worthy of this much quiet. "She's walking with memory," the braided woman said to someone behind her. "You can hear it in her pause." A man sitting cross-legged on the ground added without looking, "She's been listening before she was listening." And that was all. She was home, but not in place, in pace. A cloth was laid before her, unfolded by an elder with skin like creased parchment and a laugh-lined mouth. They served her a cup of something that smelled like first rain on hot stone. It had no name, and yet when she drank it, her shoulders forgot how to be tense. Later, they gathered at the center of the circle, not in ceremony, but in sharing. Each dreamer placed something small by the central lantern, a stone shaped like a sleeping ear, a string of bells that only rang near thunder, a spoon carved from driftwood and lullaby. When it was Nell's turn, she placed her clock. Oren, still pulsing, still listening. The hand moved for the first time since the bookstore. It pointed now to a symbol shaped like a window open with night pouring in. One dream carrier placed a hand over it, eyes fluttering shut, and then said quietly to the group, "She doesn't measure time, she catches what spills from it." They leaned their heads in small agreement, the way leaves do when wind mentions something important. That evening, under stars that drifted slower than usual, Nell sat with the caravan around an invisible fire. They did not tell stories, they felt them. Dream threads floated by the dozens, memories and visuals wrapped in silence, shared with no language but warmth. No one tugged, no one named. You simply sat still, and the threads nestled near you if they chose to be held. Nell cradled one. It showed her a mountain sleeping for 10,000 years. Inside it, a bell that had not rung in 500, and yet the sound was still preparing. She smiled, set it free. Eventually, one of the caravan, someone very old or just very slow, spoke quietly. "The world still sleeps, but sometimes forgets how." And another added, with a voice like breath over moss, "That's why we remain gentle." They turned toward Nell at last, not in demand, but invitation. "Do you want to walk with us?" She didn't answer with yes. She just sat up straighter, breathed deeper, and let the watch rest on the center of her hand, where it thrummed rhythmically, steadily, soft, and the lantern beside her slid lower, not to mark a beginning, but to say, "You are already in motion." Night was thinner now, not gone, just stretched like worn velvet that still clings to the sky but lets the edges fray in faint streaks of grey. The caravan began to stir, not all at once, not with bustle, just one light going dark, a kettle clicking into silence, a door easing open on its own. This was no dramatic departure. They were simply leaving gently, as they always had. Nell stood just beyond the circle of wagons, the sleepwalker's watch tucked into the ribbon of her cloak, still humming against her middle, and beside her a woman dressed in silver-threaded linens pointed without raising a hand. "The first paths are usually sideways," she said. "What do you mean?" She smiled barely. "Not forward, not backward, just beside where others are too busy to look." Nell nodded and began walking alongside the caravan, not toward towns, not down roads. She walked between forgotten places, a rooftop garden no one visited in 3 seasons. Wind left small thoughts there, scattered like petals. Nell collected one. "I miss the slowness of my father buttering toast, a library stairwell cool and untouched just before opening, where someone had written chalk words on the wall 5 years ago. 'Remember to wonder,' a playground bench, worn, smooth, but clean. A child had fallen asleep there once, mid-laugh. The bench still held the echo of it like a song in a jar. In each place, Nell left something small, not items, but presence, a pause, a breath, a glance that lingered just long enough to be real. And the dream threads responded, caught in fence posts, woven into curtains, slipped between pages in half-read books. Each thread didn't need to be taken, just noticed, and when she did, they soothed, they loosened, they slowed. No one followed Nell, but she never walked alone. Sometimes a caravan wagon would appear just over the hill. Sometimes the glimmer of a lantern spun past the corner of her sight. Sometimes she felt Elian's silence like an echo in her pocket. Even if he wasn't there, he had been. That was enough. Then came a night that wasn't quite night, that blue hour where street lamps hum quietly and birds think about stirring but don't. Nell stood at the edge of a small neighborhood park, only one swing set, one crooked lamppost, and the sense that someone somewhere couldn't sleep tonight. She waited, let her breath slow, and then the watch pulsed. Once she turned. There, a house with windows mostly dark, but one light on upstairs. A child's room. She didn't approach the door, didn't knock. She simply walked until she found a place, not too near, not too far, and sat beneath a tree. With her hand on the ground, she closed her eyes, let stillness expand in waves, and far above her, inside that window, a restless child's thoughts began to settle, not into dreams yet, but into space wide enough to remember how. The caravan would leave no sign behind. Nell wouldn't get a thanks, but sometimes that's the whole point. The path without footprints keeps moving, not to be seen, but to make others feel seen in silence. When she stood again, morning yawned quietly behind the hills. Light spilled onto the path, one paved not with stone, but with stories only the sky records, and she walked on, one step slower. She didn't approach the door, didn't knock. She simply walked until she found a place, not too near, not too far, and sat beneath a tree. With her hand on the ground, she closed her eyes, let stillness expand in waves, and far above her, inside that window, a restless child's thoughts began to settle, not into dreams yet, but into space wide enough to remember how. The caravan would leave no sign behind. Nell wouldn't get a thanks, but sometimes that's the whole point. The path without footprints keeps moving, not to be seen, but to make others feel seen in silence. When she stood again, morning yawned quietly behind the hills. Light spilled onto the path, one paved not with stone, but with stories only the sky records, and she walked on, one step slower than yesterday. Outside the trees rustled once, only once, just enough to mark a passing breeze that carried no news, but smelled faintly of cinnamon, paper, and worn shoes, the scent of someone who had travelled not far, but well. In the book tucked near the firewood pile, one with blank pages that only recorded moments when stillness was genuine, a dozen new entries had written themselves in soft silver ink. A bookstore window cleaned, a lantern lowered in recognition, a bench warmed by 5 minutes of silence, a swing finally stilled, a child sleeping unburdened, a caravan wagon on a rooftop in Berlin, a memory not forgotten but set gently aside, a tune hummed in sleep by no one in particular. Elian sipped a mug of root tea, stared at Oren ticking now and then. No alarm, no rush, no message, just movement kept for meaning, not for marking. And behind him, gently nudged under the stove, a second watch, one without thread, not yet pulsing, not yet paired, but waiting, as clocks often do, for the next name spoken by someone ready to move slower than time.